I moved out of the city in June 2020. There weren't many options for renting, but I managed to find something decent. I did the entire move myself with a rental truck, which took up my whole weekend, but it was worth it to get out of a cramped apartment in the city. It wasn't pleasant, and I just wanted a place to myself without being squeezed in with a bunch of people. The first night in the new house, strange things started happening. I was unpacking boxes in my bedroom when I heard my phone receive a notification from downstairs. I went down the stairs and picked up my phone from the kitchen counter. It was a text message from an unknown number, welcoming me to the neighborhood. I hadn't met the neighbors yet, and I already had my landlord's number saved, so this was a bit unsettling. I didn't respond and went back to unpacking. When I finished with my bedroom, I went downstairs again and started organizing the living room. I set up the TV stand and connected the sofa. I wasn't trying to do everything in one day, but I wanted to get the essentials done so I could enjoy the house a bit more. The last thing I had to do that night was the bathroom. I grabbed a box and unpacked some things in the downstairs bathroom, then moved on to the upstairs bathroom. While organizing my things, I heard my phone receive another notification. I was getting annoyed, thinking it was the same unknown neighbor from earlier. After a minute or so, I went back downstairs. I headed to the counter, but my phone wasn't there. I looked around but couldn't find it. I was sure I had left it on the counter, but I was tired and thought maybe I had put it somewhere else without realizing it. I checked all the bathrooms but found nothing. I washed my face to wake myself up a bit and figured my phone would turn up eventually, so I continued organizing the bathroom. I had taken a week off work, so I wasn't worried about staying up late or sleeping in too much. I wanted to get as much done as possible before going back to work, knowing I'd be too tired to do it later. Once I finished organizing the bathroom, I gathered all the empty boxes and took them to the garage. As I came back inside, I froze from across the room. I saw my phone. It was on the counter, clearly visible. My head was spinning as I walked over and picked it up. I had received a text message about 10 minutes earlier. It was a photo of my sofa, taken from inside the living room. The sofa was fully assembled, which meant the photo was taken right after I'd gone upstairs. My head started spinning. I quickly searched the room. I opened all the closets and checked behind everything. The house was still mostly empty, so there wasn't anywhere to hide. I was scared, questioning everything. I even stood exactly where the photo had been taken in the middle of the living room. It wasn't until then that my brain started working again, and I realized I needed to call the police immediately. I grabbed my phone, but I immediately received another text message. It said, "Go outside." Then the doorbell rang a few seconds later, which scared me even more. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom while calling the police. More and more text messages kept coming, demanding that I go outside. There was banging on the front door, and then everything went quiet for a minute. No more text messages. No movement outside. Then I heard faint footsteps walking around the house. They reached the backyard and stopped in the yard. But then everything went silent again. It stayed quiet until the police arrived. They searched the entire house, inside and out, but found nothing except for a couple of shoe prints. Those could have been from anyone, as the house had been viewed by several people before I moved in, and I hadn't had a chance to clean the floors. What disturbs me the most is that someone was inside my house, taking pictures and everything, and I had no idea. I've been living in the same house for almost a year now, and haven't had any more incidents. My mom's been a cleaner all her life. Back in the mid-'80s, she serviced both suburban and rural areas. picking up jobs from business cards left at local shops and through referrals. She was good at what she did, and word got around quickly. I guess you could say that's what led her to one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. One day, she got a call from this elderly sounding woman. The woman was polite enough, but there was something off about the whole thing from the start. She wanted my mom to clean an old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, which wasn't too unusual, except for the way she talked. She kept making all these weird demands, like asking my mom to make sure all the doors stayed locked and not to worry if she heard strange noises. The woman also refused to meet in person, saying she'd leave the key under the doormat and that my mom should leave the payment on the kitchen counter when she was done. Now, my mom's no fool, but the woman offered to pay her a lot more than what she'd usually make for a job like this. And back then, money was tight. So despite her gut telling her to maybe steer clear of this one, she agreed. The day of the job, she drove out to the farmhouse. It was way more isolated than she expected, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The kind of house where you'd expect to see ghosts in the windows. Still, she reminded herself that it was just another job and that she'd be in and out in a few hours. True to her word, the key was under the doormat, just like the woman said. As soon as she stepped inside, my mom said she felt something was wrong. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just this heavy feeling like she was being watched. But she had a job to do, so she pushed the unease aside and got to work. An hour in, while she was scrubbing down the kitchen counters, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door shutting. She froze. The woman had said no one would be home, and my mom was certain she'd locked the door behind her. Heart pounding, she grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy frying pan, and slowly made her way to the back of the house. No one was there. The door was closed, but she could see through the dusty window that the path leading to the woods was empty. Trying to calm herself down, she convinced herself that maybe the door hadn't latched properly, and a gust of wind had blown it shut. But deep down, she knew that didn't make sense. There was no wind that day, and the door had been locked. Shaking it off, she decided to finish the job as quickly as possible. She made her way upstairs to the bedrooms, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread crawling up her spine. That's when she found them. Black and white photos, dozens of them, scattered across the bed in the master bedroom. But they weren't just any photos. They were of her, my mom, in her car, outside our house. Even at the other homes she cleaned. Some were taken through windows, others over fences. She could see herself in the photos, caught in moments when she thought she was alone, completely unaware someone had been watching her. She said the air left the room, and she felt like she was going to be sick. Panicking, she grabbed the house phone. It was one of those old rotary ones, and dialed the police. She didn't even bother explaining the situation. She just told them to come quickly. Then, she ran out of the house, down the long driveway, and waited near the road until she saw the flashing lights. When the cops arrived, they searched the house but found no one. The old woman who hired my mom was questioned, but she claimed the house had been broken into recently and that she had no idea about the photos. My mom didn't buy it for a second. She was sure that woman was involved somehow, but the police eventually dropped the case, saying they couldn't find any evidence of foul play. 4 months later, we moved to a new town. My mom never took another job in a rural area again. To this day, she's convinced that the woman who hired her knew exactly what was going on. But her motives, those remain a mystery. And that old farmhouse, well, she never went back. Sometimes, I wonder if whoever took those photos is still out there, waiting in the shadows, watching. This story happened a week ago. I was with my girlfriend in my car on a Saturday night, around 11 p.m. Everything was going great, and we were driving around for fun. We were at a red light, and honestly, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We were having fun with the music turned up loud. In front of us was an old red Toyota Camry that suddenly started reversing towards my car. I didn't think much of it at first, and then the car turned on its hazard lights and turned right. My girlfriend and I continued straight ahead. 2 to 3 minutes later, we found ourselves on a somewhat isolated road outside the city. And who do we see at an intersection? The same car from earlier. There were 4. 5 men inside, and they were pointing at us. They had clearly blocked the road. I kept my cool, turned right and left quickly, and sped off. I glanced at my rearview mirror, and the men were still chasing us. I tried to stay calm, even though I couldn't feel my legs anymore. They tried to block our path again, but I really pressed down on the pedal and sped forward. I told myself that the only solution was to park and turn off my headlights, because it was even more dangerous to keep driving like that, essentially engaging in a car chase. So I checked my mirror, and they were no longer visible. I saw a spot, parked, and immediately turned off my headlights. I asked my girlfriend to keep her head down. We heard them drive past, and they never came back. My girlfriend and I were in shock, and we still don't know why that car chased us. Afterward, we continued driving and were talking about how we had just experienced an assault when my girlfriend was about to call the police. Just then, a police car appeared right behind us. I turned on my hazard lights, and they understood that something was wrong. They pulled up beside us on the left, and we explained what had happened. They escorted us to our destination to protect us and alerted other police officers patrolling the area. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the license plate number. That's my story. What really bothers me is that I still don't know why those men chased my girlfriend and me. So, this happened last month, and I can't stop thinking about it. I live in a tiny mountain village that's pretty much off the grid. No public transport. No easy way to get anywhere unless you've got a car. My daily routine involves driving to the nearest train station and catching a train to work. There are 2 roads that lead to my village. One is longer, well lit, and wide enough for 2 cars. The other is a narrow, unlit road that cuts through a dense forest, but it's faster. I usually take the safer, longer route because it's just more convenient. But last week, things didn't go as planned. We had this persistent customer at work who wouldn't leave, so we ended up closing the store after 9 p.m. By the time I made it to my car, it was already close to 10. I was starving, exhausted, and just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. So, against my better judgment, I decided to take the forest road. It's about a 20-minute drive through the woods, before you hit the outskirts of the village. About 10 minutes in, after a sharp turn, I saw something lying in the middle of the road. Now, there are a few hiking trails that cross through the area, and sometimes tourists leave their cars by the road to explore. But not at night, and definitely not in the dead of winter. I slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting whatever it was. Turns out, it was an old military bicycle, like the kind the Swiss Army used back in the day. It was just lying there, abandoned, almost dead center on the road. The weird part, there's this older lady from the village, Mrs. Robinson, who's known for riding her bike on this road, even at odd hours. So, I figured it might be hers. I got out of the car, left the headlights on, and started calling out, "Mrs. Robinson?" I thought maybe she'd taken a bad fall or something, so I walked over to the edge of the road and called again. "Is anyone there?" That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees below. This forest is full of wildlife, but whatever made that sound was too big and too indistinct in the darkness for me to identify. My heart was pounding, and I instinctively turned back towards my car to grab my phone. But when I looked back, the bike was gone. I started to panic. I scanned the area, but beyond the first few trees, everything was pitch black. Then I heard the growl again, closer this time, and something was moving in the shadows. I slowly backed towards my car, and just as I reached it, the headlights went out. That was it. I bolted, jumped into the car, and tried to start it. Nothing. The battery was dead. I locked the doors and frantically grabbed my phone. I called for a tow truck, and they said they'd be there in about an hour. I spent that hour glued to my phone, trying to distract myself with funny videos, but it didn't help. Twice, I swear, I saw a huge dark mass circling my car. At one point, whatever it was, brushed against the right side of the car, causing it to rock slightly. When the tow truck finally showed up, I was a nervous wreck. Of course, by then, there was no sign of the bike or that thing. The mechanic jump started my battery, and I was able to drive to the nearest garage. I didn't even think twice. I called a taxi to take me home and made sure to tell the driver to take the other road. Later, I found out that the alternator in my car was fried, which is why the battery wasn't recharging. But here's the creepy part. The mechanic said there's no way the headlights being on for a few minutes would drain the battery completely. I haven't taken the forest road since. Not during the day, and definitely not at night. Whatever was out there that night, I'm not eager to meet it again. I had a group of friends with whom I did practically everything. We always had something crazy to do on weekends, and during the summer, we were up to something almost every night. During the summer of our junior year, one of my friends told us about an abandoned hospital. It was a 2-hour drive from us, but we were all intrigued. We had explored abandoned buildings before, but nothing as large as a hospital. Of course, we decided to drive out the next day. The hospital was on the outskirts of a small town, so we stopped to buy some food before parking and walking a couple of miles to the hospital. We arrived at the building around 1 a.m., when the town was quiet and still. Standing outside, it was just a crumbling building. Something that had been abandoned for years, but it had an eerie feeling that drew us in. Looking back, I can't believe how naive we were. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. We slipped through the fence that surrounded it and sneaked inside. The doors were obviously boarded up and locked, as were the windows. But one of my friends pointed out a window with the board ripped off. We climbed through the broken window and fell inside the hospital. As soon as we entered, an extremely loud crash echoed through the building's hallways. We assumed it was because the building was old, but the silence that followed was deafening. Looking around, the walls were crumbling, and there was a stale smell that made it hard to breathe. We stayed together, never straying more than a couple of rooms from each other as we explored the hallways. I had no idea what we were looking for, but I felt like there had to be something hidden in that place, and I was determined to find it. The hospital was really large, with hundreds of rooms and hallways, and at some point, my friend Steve and I accidentally got separated from the other two. We didn't notice until we had gone down several hallways. We retraced our steps and tried to find them, but all the hallways and rooms looked the same. "Guys, are you around here?" we shouted, but their voices echoed through all the rooms and hallways, and we couldn't locate them. We walked in the direction we thought their voices were coming from, hoping they knew how to get back as we were completely lost in this maze of hallways. As we walked past a couple of rooms, I saw a faint light coming from under a closed door. I carefully approached, pressing my ear against the door and listening closely. I didn't hear anything. I cautiously opened the door and saw a dim lamp amid a pile of trash. Boxes, blankets, food wrappers, all stacked around the lamp as if someone was living there. I turned around to call Steve, but my eyes landed on the corner of the room where a man was standing in the darkness, pointing a gun directly at me. He looked disgusting with empty, lifeless eyes. I slowly raised my hands and began to back away, mumbling apologies under my breath. "Who are you talking to?" Steve said from behind me, completely unaware of the situation. When he saw the man, Steve ran, and I followed him. But suddenly, my ears were ringing, and the man fired at us. We kept running aimlessly, following Steve until by chance we ran into the other two friends. They were worried after hearing the gunshots, and we quickly explained that we needed to leave. They led us back to the broken window, and we got out of there as fast as we could. No one was hurt, but Steve and I were traumatized. After that, we stayed away from isolated and abandoned places, knowing that there could be any crazy person living there, ready to defend their self-assigned property. We didn't take any chances after that. I was on my way home after a family reunion in another state. I had booked a motel room to spend the night and planned to finish the trip the next day. There were several delays during the drive, the biggest of which was construction blocking the main highway, which added a lot of extra time to my route and caused me to get lost for a while. Eventually, the sun began to set, and I was really tired. I still had 5 hours left to get home, and I was frustrated by all the delays, which only added to my exhaustion. I tried to stay awake and push through the last 5 hours, but the long, empty road made it impossible. I saw a sign on the side of the road indicating a motel 20 miles away. So, I decided to stop there and continue the trip the next day. When I arrived at the motel, there was only one other car in the parking lot, which I assumed belonged to the motel employee. I got out of the car and walked into the reception area. An elderly woman was behind the counter, talking on the phone. When I walked in, I asked for a room for the night, and she handed me a key. I then went to find the room. The motel was a single-story building with about 10 to 15 rooms. I walked to the second room from the end. I opened it, turned on the lights, and saw that it was what I expected. An outdated and somewhat dirty place. I guess that's what you get in the middle of nowhere. I left all my things in the car, as I planned to just sleep for a few hours, and then continue the trip. I went back and locked the door. As I walked toward the bed, I heard noises coming from the room next door. Someone slammed a door shut, which wasn't unusual in itself. But given that there were no other cars in the parking lot, and the motel was in the middle of nowhere, it seemed strange for a moment. Then I heard footsteps, as if someone was walking toward the wall that connected our rooms, and then they stopped right next to it. Considering that the layout of the neighboring room was the same as mine, that person would be standing against a blank wall, which didn't make sense. I turned off the lights and got into bed, intending to get some sleep and continue the trip later. However, I had trouble falling asleep, and about 30 minutes passed before I finally did. Suddenly, I was woken up by a loud knock on the door. I got up, walked to the door, and opened it, but no one was there. I stepped out into the hallway and looked down the row of doors, but didn't see anything unusual. I went back inside and locked the door. I lay in bed, uneasy and confused. Then, about 30 minutes later, there was another knock on my door. This time, I looked through the peephole and saw a woman standing outside. I opened the door and asked her why she was knocking on my door in the middle of the night and what she needed. The woman looked exhausted, with red eyes, and she seemed really tired. She pointed to the door next to mine and said she needed my help with something in her room. I asked what she needed, but she just repeated that it was right there. I wasn't sure what she meant by right there, so I stepped out into the hallway and looked around the corner, and she went into the room. She stopped in the center and waited for me to follow her. There was an eerie silence before I finally stepped into the room. I felt a chill as the door closed behind me. The woman looked at me with a strange, unsettling expression. She was standing in the center of the room, and there was an uncomfortable atmosphere. Sensing that something was very wrong, I quickly returned to my room. I locked the door and stayed inside. I could hear the woman return to the neighboring room. Then, suddenly, I heard two men arguing loudly in the next room. I never saw them, as they must have been hiding. The three of them started yelling at each other for a minute before I heard the door open and all of them ran outside. I called the police, but it took them more than 30 minutes to arrive, and by the time they did, everyone was already gone. The woman who worked at the motel told me she hadn't checked anyone else in that night, which meant they had probably broken into the room illegally. It was clear that it was a trap led by the woman to lure me into the neighboring room, where the two men would then jump me, or worse. I often think about how close I came to never being seen again. I was 15 years old, quite a few years ago now. One evening, I was home alone because my parents were at some friend's place. Before I start, I should mention that I live in the countryside, in a fairly populated area. I was chilling in my room and decided to go check if all the doors and windows were locked. I went around and everything was secure. So, I headed back to my room and continued watching Breaking Bad. Yes, I still remember it clearly, and you'll soon understand why. About an hour later, between two episodes, I decided to open my window because it was hot. It must have been around 1:30 a.m., or something like that. And as I opened the window, I noticed a strong draft. I thought about it and realized something was seriously wrong, because an hour earlier, I had locked everything. I decided to look out the window to see if my parents' car was back, but no, it wasn't there. I immediately ran to lock my bedroom door, stayed completely silent, and listened closely. I didn't hear much at first, but suddenly I heard the creaking of the floorboards on the first floor. I knew that sound well, because it's been there for years, whenever you step on a particular plank in my house. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone had broken into my house. I slowly got back on my bed and hid under the covers to call the police. I quickly got someone on the phone and explained everything you've just read. They immediately understood how serious the situation was. They told me a police car would be there in 5 minutes, and that they'd stay on the line with me until the officers arrived. About 3 minutes later, I heard the person start climbing the stairs. They were coming up slowly, step by step. I could hear them open my parents' bedroom door, turn on the light, and open the bathroom door, as if they were searching for someone. After realizing no one was there, they came out and slowly headed towards my door. At that moment, a million thoughts raced through my head. Was this the end for me? They tried to open the door and realized it was locked. Then they started knocking. Very slowly. Knock. Knock. about 10 times over the span of 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity. Right then, I heard a car pull up in front of my house. It was the police. They entered through the front door and started shouting, "Police, is anyone there?" Hearing this, the intruder began trying to break down my door. They weren't able to, and after a few seconds, realizing they couldn't get in, they stopped. There was silence for a few seconds, and then suddenly, a gunshot. Bang! I heard the guy collapse to the floor, and the officers rushed up the stairs. They shouted, "Is anyone here?" I said yes, and they told me not to open the door under any circumstances. I quickly realized why when I saw blood pooling under my door and the foul smell filling the room. I asked them, "Was it you who?" But the officer cut me off immediately, saying he did it himself. That's my story. I later found out that this guy had already killed several people a few weeks before. This story is absolutely true and happened to me a few years ago. I'll just start the story from the beginning. A few friends and I decided to meet up in a small, desolate town for a weekend reunion. We were excited to catch up with our buddy Eric, who we hadn't seen in ages. Eric had this secret lakeside campsite in mind, complete with a cozy fire pit for our gathering. As the sun began to set, we set up camp and started reminiscing about the good old days. It was all fun and games until twilight fell, and a weird vibe washed over Eric and me. One of our friends, James, had crashed out in the car, totally oblivious to the growing unease. Then, Eric dropped a bombshell. He mentioned the possibility of a skinwalker lurking in the area. Yes, you read that right, a skinwalker. Now, for those of you who don't know, these are creatures from Native American folklore. They can take on any form, even human, and are known for their sinister tricks and lurking in the shadows. I thought Eric was just trying to freak us out, but the seriousness in his eyes made me think twice. Apparently, folks around here believed in these things, and some claimed to have seen them. It was time to tread carefully. Naturally, curiosity got the best of Mark and me. We left James, snoring away in the car, and ventured into the woods, thinking it might be a prank pulled by nearby campers. We hiked up a hill that separated our campsite from the others, calling out and expecting a response. But the woods remained eerily quiet, and the rustling behind us grew louder. Back at the campsite, our friends were in a frenzy, frantically packing up their stuff. Eric had started a fire, hoping it would keep the skinwalker at bay. We hurried to gather our belongings, the forest feeling more ominous by the second, and that's when it happened. A spine-chilling scream tore through the silence, echoing from the other campsite. It was the kind of scream that curdles your blood, and it sent shivers down my spine. Eric's warning about the skinwalker raced through my mind. These things were known to be fast and nearly impossible to outrun. Panic set in as we scrambled to load our gear into the car. The darkness was all encompassing now, and that bone-chilling silence after the scream was too much to bear. Finally, we started the car, and the headlights cut through the pitch. Black night, but there it was, emerging from the bushes beside us. The skinwalker. This grotesque creature had glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through your soul. Its form twisted and contorted, as if it couldn't decide on a shape. Without a second thought, Eric floored the gas pedal, and the car roared to life. The creature gave chase for a moment, its eyes burning like fiery orbs in the rearview mirror, before vanishing into the abyss. We drove on in harrowing silence, hearts pounding. That encounter with the skinwalker was something straight out of a nightmare. A stark reminder that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than we can ever imagine. As we left that forsaken town, the memory of those glowing yellow eyes haunted our thoughts, serving as a grim testament to the spine, tingling legend of the skinwalker that we had unwittingly stumbled upon that fateful night. You know that feeling when you think something is just a minor annoyance, only for it to spiral into something far more sinister. That's what happened to me 9 months ago. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It was just another day on my way home from work. I'm cruising down the highway in my Mustang, music blasting, when I get stuck behind this white Buick. The guy is crawling along in the left lane. The lane for passing, and I'm getting frustrated. So I do what any normal person would do and get a little close, hoping he'll get the hint and move over. Big mistake. Instead of moving, the guy starts slamming on his brakes. Like, repeatedly. I almost rear-end him, and my heart is pounding in my chest. We hit a red light, and he finally switches to the right lane. So I stay on the left. Then, he rolls down his window and starts yelling at me. I can't hear everything, but he's pissed. Something about me being stupid and not knowing how to drive. I'm about to yell back when he suddenly pulls a U-turn right in the middle of the intersection. Now he's facing me, phone out, recording, and still screaming. My stomach drops. Something about this guy feels off. This isn't just road rage anymore. The light turns green, and I take off, hoping to leave him behind. But he's not done. I switch highways, take random turns, but every time I glance in my rearview mirror, there he is. He's following me. Not just following. He's chasing me. I'm hitting 90, weaving through traffic, trying to lose him. I don't want to lead him back to my house, so I start heading back toward work. Maybe I can find someone there to help. But when I try to take a right turn, traffic's too thick. I swerve through a gas station, barely slowing down, and he's right on my tail. At this point, I'm freaking out. I'm shaking, trying to figure out what to do next, when I finally hit another red light. He's in the straight lane now, but he's not going anywhere. Instead, he points his phone at me again, recording every move I make. His eyes are locked on me, and I can feel my blood turn to ice. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it's over. He turns around and drives off, leaving me sitting there, stunned and terrified. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know why he was recording me or why he was so bent on following me. Maybe it was just road rage that got out of hand, but something about it felt wrong, like I'd narrowly escaped something much darker. I've thought about going to the police, but what would I say? A guy got mad at me on the road and chased me for a while. They'd probably laugh me out of the station. But I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't kept my cool, if I'd made just one wrong move, I might not be here to tell this story. So, yeah, be careful out there. You never know who's behind the wheel of that car in your rearview mirror. I'm not sure if this is the right place to share my story, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. It's been haunting me for years, and I hope that by sharing it here, I can finally find some closure. This is a story about a creepy male nurse I encountered in a hospital, and it's something I'll never forget. It was a cold, dark winter evening when I found myself in the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital. I had been suffering from a high fever, and my body ached with every movement. The waiting room was filled with people, all lost in their own pain and misery, waiting to be seen by doctors and nurses. I found an empty seat and sat down, shivering from a combination of fever and anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, my name was called, and I was led to a small examination room. A middle-aged nurse with thinning hair and glasses introduced himself as Mark. He had an air of unease about him, like he didn't want to be there. I didn't think much of it at the time, attributing it to the late hour and the demands of the job. Mark began the examination, asking me routine questions about my symptoms and medical history. He was cold and clinical, but I assumed that was just his way. As he touched my arm to check my temperature, a chill ran down my spine. His touch was unsettlingly cold, and his eyes seemed to linger on me for a moment longer than necessary. I tried to push aside my unease and continued to answer his questions. But as the examination progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He seemed too interested in my personal life, asking questions about where I lived, whether I lived alone, and if I had any family nearby. I answered truthfully, but his probing questions sent alarm bells ringing in my head. As Mark finished the examination, he told me that I would need to stay overnight for observation due to my high fever. He assured me it was just a precaution, but his smile seemed insincere. He left the room, saying he would return shortly with the necessary paperwork. Alone in the dimly lit room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to trust my instincts and began to gather my things. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint whisper outside the door. It was Mark, speaking to someone in hushed tones. I strained to listen and heard my name mentioned. They were talking about me. Panicked, I quietly opened the door and peered into the hallway. Mark was standing there, talking to another nurse I hadn't seen before. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed me. Mark's eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of anger and panic in his gaze. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there, away from Mark and whatever sinister plan he had in mind. I ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, my fevered mind struggling to find an exit. Finally, I burst through a set of double doors and found myself in a deserted wing of the hospital. It was eerily quiet, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, unsettling shadows. As I stumbled down the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I couldn't go back the way I came, so I ducked into an empty patient room and hid in the darkness. My heart was in my throat as I watched Mark and the other nurse pass by, their faces twisted in frustration. I stayed hidden in that room for what felt like hours, waiting for the coast to clear. Finally, when I couldn't hear any more footsteps, I cautiously emerged from my hiding spot and made my way to the hospital's main entrance. I reported the incident to the hospital administration and the police, but no one could find any trace of Mark or the mysterious nurse. I never set foot in that hospital again, and I still shudder at the thought of the creepy male nurse and the whispered conversation I overheard. I'll never know what they had planned for me. They claimed that there was no record of such individuals working at St. Mary's Hospital. To this day, I have no idea who they were or what their intentions were that night.